Hello. I'm so excited to have the fantastic Michael Land with me. Michael, it's an honor to have you with me today. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Pieter. Great to be here.
So, I would like to tell you about my high school years. And my high school, driving in the car, at home, outside in the garden, sounded something like this. And I grew up with Monkey Island music. Throw that thing over there. I grew up with I grew up with Monkey Island all my life. And it shaped me as a composer, it shaped me as a musician. I think a lot of the way that I shape my phrases, my own melodies, are greatly influenced by Monkey Island and by your own work. So thank you very much for your contribution to music.
Thank you.
So I would like to. So you've heard me play the recorder now. What
hmm
instruments do you play?
Um, I started on piano when I was young, and took the rigorous piano lessons till I was about 12, and then had just quit and started
Mm-hmm.
improvising more freely. And once I actually quit the lessons, that's when I actually really started to learn the piano, because then I started to improvise and explore kind of more compositionally how the instrument could take you different places. Around the same time, I started learning electric bass, and I got really deeply into electric bass, and then from there, kind of got into guitar. And then from there, just actually in college, I studied electronic music pretty intensely. That was in the old days when there were no keyboards. It was analog synthesis and tape music. And then from there, I got into studying electronics, more seriously computers. And then from the computers, that led me to my job at Lucasarts. So it was kind of an
Fascinating.
interesting path, yeah.
Where did you study when you finished when you finished school? At which universities did you study?
So I studied. I got a degree in music at Harvard, which was mostly a very traditional and conservative program, except for the electronic music studio, which was this little enclave. And the professor there, Ivan Sharapnin, was a real visionary and a great composer in his own right, from a great line of composers. And he really opened up all his students' ears. Like, all the students who went through his course, they all kind of went off and did interesting things. And then from there, I went to Mills College, the Center for Contemporary Music, and studied electronic music. And that was, again, sort of this enclave inside, a larger, sort of more conservative campus. And that was, for me, really interesting, because the musical aesthetic there was very harsh, and in a way, very much focused on the methodology of producing the sound, and less focused on the actual, sound itself being an emotional experience. But the funny thing is that over, I don't know, I was there for about 3 years to get my degree, a master's degree. The process of just being immersed in that music had two interesting effects. Number one, I actually stopped composing music when I was there, and focused more on technology. So that had a sort of a side effect, which is I learned the other skill, which is the computer skills, which ultimately allowed me to get a place in the video game industry early on. But the other thing that was interesting is, after a few years of really being immersed in what I guess you could call algorithmic music, algorithmic electronic music, uh, I started to really appreciate it in a different way. Not so much in the way I used to appreciate the music that I grew up loving. Grew up loving rock and roll, Grateful Dead, classical Beethoven, Renaissance music, even earlier medieval music. I love old music. It touches me on an emotional level. This music, I started to appreciate it on a sort of a pattern recognition level, on the level of, like, okay, I'm starting to understand how to hear the algorithms in the sounds and appreciate that, just sort of craftsmanship and innovation that goes into creating all these complex sounds that have these patterns that are really thought carefully about. Even though it didn't
Yes,
really
exactly,
touch
exactly.
me on a musical level, it touched me on that other level. So
Mm.
quite a broad range of musical backgrounds before I got into the video game industry.
So interesting. As I prepared for this interview today, I listened to the main theme from Escape from Monkey Island and a few other tracks. Um, and now, as an adult and as a more seasoned composer myself, I heard different sounds which I didn't notice before at high school. It's different. Like I grew up listening to your music. I'm very familiar with it, but just kind of you're part of the texture. And now, as and really analytically thinking about the music, I'm like, whoa, I've never heard it. Wow, oh my goodness, wow, that's amazing. But you're not always familiar with these things, and
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. When you study something, you really get to understand it on a deeper level. And
Yes.
also, it can be difficult to study at a university. I remember when I was studying at the University of Pretoria, we did a poster session for undergraduate final year, and I was writing about Tomb Raider, Legend,
Hmm.
Adversary, and Underworld. And I had a beautiful poster with Laura Croft, and of course, I was the only person who had anything that wasn't classical music. And one of my mentors stared at me like I came from the moon. What alien
Yeah.
music is this? Who is this? What is it even relevant?
Yes, yes, exactly. I have a similar story, not from myself, but from Clint Bajakian told me this story when he was studying at, I think when he was at Northwestern at the time, or it might have been at the conservatory, one or the other. New England Conservatory is where he went. He was, I think it was actually at the conservatory. He was writing a piece of music. So you have to remember, in academia, certainly not so. They're a little more open-minded now.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
aesthetic has kind of come back from the edge. But
yeah.
back in the I guess this was like the '80s. There was a 12 tone was it. You wrote 12 tone music. That was all there was worth writing. Everything else had been done. So that was the new frontier. But Clint was writing some piece of music that had actual chords in it. It was like, oh, it's an E chord, And one of his professors pulled him aside and said, from time to time, an older guy, we all fall prey to the tendency to drift into sentimentality. And it was just like different worlds, different universes. And Clint has an absolutely gorgeous melodic sense, and sentimentality, no way. It's like real feeling, feeling. It's not sentimentality. So it's it's funny how music education. I mean, I hope they're doing a better job now of being open-minded to all the different types of music out there. But they have a way of deciding what is the right way to do music, and then stuff outside of their structure they just can't accept it very easily. But that doesn't mean we should follow in their footsteps. We should all keep our ears open and go where our own instincts take us.
But of course, this problem isn't only in music. It's in, I think, even the sciences, all over the humanities. If you bring
Yeah,
in something
yeah,
that's too radical, even
yeah,
if it's solidified, but I think especially in the arts, maybe classical music, arts is okay. I think drama, etc., music, film scores, but thank God today we have film scoring institutes and
yes,
conservatories where you can study film scoring, and that's
yeah.
brought a big change also in the gaming industry. So when you finished university, how did you start your first job?
Yeah, I got lucky. My first job, Peter McConnell actually got me my intro for my first job, which is at Lexicon, which makes signal processors. They have really high end reverbs, and they had a bunch of great products. They were in Massachusetts, and so he had gotten a job there, and through that connection, I got a job there. So that was a real programming job. I was doing real coding professionally at that point. worked there for a few years, moved out to California, continued to work for them on a consulting basis, and then that kind of trailed away. And I was looking for my next job after that, and my mom was like, "You should look in the newspaper." I'm like, "No, there's no good jobs in the newspaper." And I was like, she's like, "No, do it." And I was like, "Okay." So I looked and I saw this little ad that said, looking for somebody to do sound design who knows C and 8086 assembly code. And I was like, "Hey, I know how to program computers and I know how to do sound.
Mm.
Check, call it up." And it turned out to be the job at Lucasarts. So that's how I.
Interesting. That's also how Nathan McCree started with Tomb Raider, also
Oh,
as a
really?
programmer of sorts, and he also found his job in the newspaper.
Wow. That's so
So
cool.
times have changed.
Times have, yeah.
So how did you start at LucasArts and then jumped into composing from
So
programming?
the job that I was hired for was, all audio. Basically, it was a single position to do all the audio, you know, top to bottom, including, programming the low level sound drivers all the way up to writing the music and doing the sound effects. So it's like everything. And back in those days, a lot of games worked that way. A lot of times the people who did the audio for the game did, they programmed the audio system, they did the sound effects, and they wrote the music. And there were a few of us out there. Dave Warhol was one of the guys out there who did that, and he was actually the one who had been working with LucasArts prior to me arriving. I think he was a consultant. They were like, okay, we need to hire somebody full time. So that's what I think ended up being my position. And so I inherited his code base, and I worked with his code and sort of evolved it a little bit. But for the most part, when I first got there, I had to just sort of jump right in and start producing because these games have schedules, and it's like there's a
Mhm.
release date. And I started in I guess it was about April of 1990, and Monkey Island was like cranking away, getting ready for a fall release. So it was like, okay, jump on board and get some stuff going. There was another game actually, Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe, that was almost basically done and ready to go out the door. And one of the pieces that I wrote as a demo piece for when I first applied to the job at LucasArts, I had a demo tape that had all this sort of kind of out there stuff, which is what I'd been doing. And after the job interview, I was like, I didn't have anything really traditional sounding on that demo tape, so I went off and I wrote a piece, which is kind of like a German march, and sent it in, and they, I guess they liked it. Eventually, I got the job, so that worked. But then when I got there, I was like, hey, that piece I wrote for that demo would work pretty well for this game. So that became my first, published piece of game music. It was the theme for Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe. But that
Mm.
was a piece I had already written before I got the job. The first music I started working on after I got the job, and on site there was Monkey Island, and that was a kind of a crunch because I don't know, we had just like I don't know 4 or 5 months to get the sound drivers integrated, get everything working, and write all the music. I had there were a few other folks that chipped in on that project. There was some folk. There was a team called Earwax in San Francisco. Barney Jones and Andy Newell, great composers, contributed some tunes. And J. Anthony White, whose nickname was Fretless, contributed some stuff. So we had some folks, add contribute a few pieces. But I think the real sort of, you know, sort of I sort of set the stylistic direction with sort of the pirate reggae thing.
Mm, mm, mm. So I was wondering, when you first conceptualized what pirate music would be, how what did you think of, and how did you decide what instruments to use and what style you would
Well,
go
I
with?
think it was actually Ron Gilbert who sort of kind of drew the X on the map, so to speak, because he was like, it's a pirate game and it takes place in the Caribbean. When in the Caribbean there's lots of reggae, so let's have pirate reggae. And I was like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So pirate reggae. So fortunately, I had some background in um, not specifically pirate music, but I was pretty familiar with like old English folk music and sort of how that kind of stuff worked. Um, I loved it. And then I also had a very unique experience with reggae because I had played reggae keyboards in a very brief tour with a guy who had played percussion with Bob Marley, and so he had a
Mm.
really solid team of reggae players, and I happened to, slot in the keyboard position. They showed me how to do the bubble, which is like, so I had done that like on stage with a guy who really knew it, and also his way of doing percussion, just watching him, and he made the drums talk. He would be like tick-tick-ting, tick-tick-tick-ting-ting. I mean, he just it's like his creative imagination was so sparkling. And then the bass player was a really good reggae bass player, and it's like, the difference between uh, white guys who play reggae bass and black guys who play reggae bass. When a white guy plays reggae bass, he puts the emphasis on the two, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, bum, bum, bum,
Mm.
bum. When a black guy plays reggae bass, he puts the emphasis in the same place, but it doesn't feel like a two. It feels like that's the one, like it's an arrival. So like the two is not the arrival of the measure. One is the arrival of the measure. So when you play the two as if it's a two, you're not really playing reggae quite right. And so that's what makes reggae just kind of sort of sort of pulse and undulate. And it's funny, you see people who are really feeling when they're really feeling the reggae man, uh, their bodies move a certain way. And a lot of that has to do with the shifting of the downbeat from the one to the two.
Mm.
So I understood all that on a sort of cellular level. And so that really helped a lot. I was able to say, oh yeah, I know English folk music. I know kind of what makes reggae work. And I just kind of put the two together. And that's where that style came from.
So, with that in mind, do you still consider yourself to be a good reggae player if you would have to perform in a concert tomorrow?
I certainly could. I could do either bass or keyboards and do a fine job of it. Yeah.
Let's do that. So in 1991, the following year, you worked on the development of the iMuse system for LeChuck's Revenge.
hmm
How do you think your composition approach changed? Because now the music had to adapt and change. How do you think
Yeah,
it
it was a
influenced
whole
you?
Yeah, completely different animal.
Mm.
So in Monkey Island 1, it was, we were using the previous sort of the earlier version of the game audio systems, and all you could do was you start a piece of music and either it plays till it ends or you make it loop and then it'll loop. And then you can stop it whenever you feel like stopping it. And those were the only things you could do back then. And it was extremely limiting. Everybody was like, this music is kind of cool, but it doesn't have. It was really obvious that it was not able to conform itself to the gameplay. And so, immediately after Monkey Island 1 was done, I was like, we gotta build a new system here. We have to build a system where the music is able to conform itself to the gameplay. And then as I started to get into it and realized these are really deep waters, then I pulled Pieter McConnell in, who had gotten me my first job, so I got him that job, and he came in, and together we kind of coded up the iMuse system. And the way that changes really, it really changes completely the way you think about music, because uh, instead of thinking about a simple loop or a single piece, I started thinking about music as networks. Like the analogy I think of most naturally is a subway map. If you think about a subway map, you have all these different lines that connect with these different nodes, which are the stations. And so you have a particular station, and maybe you can get to, from this station to this station to this station, but maybe you can get to that station in the middle, through some other way where you're coming from, and so you have to, and so you take you start with really understanding the geography of the game world. And you say, here's the geography of the game world. You map it out almost like a subway map. And then you start thinking, okay, this region has this feeling, and this region has this feeling, but how is it that the music in this region, if you're going from this region over to this region, that it's not just the music has to be right for each region, but the transition between the regions has to take you through the right emotional change that the
Mm.
regions demand you go through to make it all work. And so you really start thinking of the whole score of the game as being essentially a map, a musical map. And all the different parts of the map have to relate to all the other parts of the map in the right way that actually aligns with how the different parts of the game align to the other parts of the game.
I mean, as a composer, I think it's for me the most difficult thing would be adjusting the beat and
Yeah,
speeding up
yeah,
the tempo, and that might be the
that was it. That was yeah. So yeah, you have to then. That's the conceptual level. Then there's the mechanical level,
exactly.
and on the mechanical level, you're dealing with essentially we sort of um, narrowed it down to a handful, like a little toolbox of techniques that kind of got us what we needed, and so those involved. Uh, Certainly, we still use loops. You're always going to use loops, but you didn't necessarily have one loop per piece of music. You might have a piece of music that has two different loops in it, and then you transition from one loop to the other loop at different places. So, like sometimes you're going through the first loop and you exit it to go into this place in this loop. Other times you leave the first loop from a different plot and go into the other second loop in a different place. So we came up with this concept we called jump hooks, where basically embedded in the MIDI, we had these system exclusive messages that would have a conditional jump, and the conditional jump would be based on like a number, right? So it'd be, jump hook 1, jump hook 2, jump hook 3, jump hook 4. And it would also contain the destination of the jump. And so you could literally say, from any point, within it all takes place within a given music file, but within a given music file, you could have different sections, and you could say any section uh, can have at any measure, at any point in any measure, and usually we did it like on beat 4, tick 400. So, like, 80 ticks before the downbeat is a good place to do it. um, and so you would have a little message that says if a certain number is set, from this point in the music, go to this chunk, this measure, this beat, this tick, and just make a jump to go there. And of course, you also have to make sure you're turning off the notes that are playing at the right after their duration has expired, even though there's no note off message in the new place. So you have to remember that, and you have to, when you get to the new place, you have to make sure the instruments are updated so that you have the right instruments on the right tracks, because they may not have the same instruments on the same tracks. Stuff like that. You have to work through all those mechanics. Um, and another trick that's very, very useful is if you have a loop for a room that, like, you couldn't do the full crazy treatment everywhere. So some stuff you did more in depth and other stuff you did less in depth. But just an example of something that was super easy and super useful. If you have a room and you have a loop that is associated with that room, and every time you go into that room, you're going to get that loop. All you have to do is you have to have 3 or 4 jump hooks at the beginning of the piece that the programmer can randomly enable one or none of these jump hooks that will take you to a different starting point in the loop. So if you every time you walk into a room, you get dropped into that piece of music in a different place, even though it's the same loop, it feels like it has a whole lot more variety than it really does. So that would be another trick. And then one of the trickier things was transition chunks. So to address your point about different tempos, if you have two pieces at a different tempo and you have to get from one to the other, you have to have a little piece of music, maybe maybe a measure and a half, maybe 2 measures long, a little chunk that whenever it's time to make that transition, you jump to that chunk, and then it has a tempo change in that chunk, and by the end of that measure, you're now at the new tempo, and then there's another jump to the other piece. So that's kind of the way we did it.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what to
1990,
say. Just
1991.
wow, 1991.
Yeah.
I think for when you have extreme creativity, it also allows you to have extreme solutions.
Yeah, that was it, because by that time Clint had been brought on and we just had all these great ideas, musical ideas, and we just were like, we want to make this work. Now, it was a bear. It was a real pain to get all this to work. And one of the things that was most painful about it was that the programmer who was doing the game programs, actually two or three of the programmers who were doing the game programming, but mostly, one or two of them had to issue these commands in the language of our music system. And so they'd have to know, set jump hook 3 when this character does this. And when this character does that, part enables was the other thing. You could turn on and off different parts, but the parts didn't just turn on when you turn the part on. You'd have part enable messages so that they would set the track that this track is now supposed to turn on, but then there'd be a message in the track saying, okay, you can turn on now. And that would be a conditional message. So it always, the melody would, the track would turn on at a naturally organic place in the melody where it made sense for a melody to start there. So all of that stuff had to be coordinated with the programmers, and they were pulling their hair out. But we managed to get it done.
And you made history.
I guess we did,
I,
yeah.
and not just history. I think you changed how programmers and musicians conceptualize music in a game.
Yeah, I think at that time, the people who were paying attention did notice it. A lot. The funny thing about it is that most of the players didn't, said, "Hey, the music's really good," but they didn't notice all of the tricks because it just sounded like
Mm.
it was supposed to sound. It just seemed normal, right? Like everybody goes to the movies, and movies do that, so it just seemed it seemed correct. But the people,
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly my point of when you study something, and you can appreciate it, knowing
yeah,
the technicalities.
yeah,
So
exactly,
your next step was Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis.
yeah.
And so I think you're really lucky to, in a way, follow in the footsteps of John Williams, even though it's from afar. Did you ever meet John Williams?
I spoke with him on the phone once. He was a lovely guy, and yeah, he's super nice.
Yeah. So at the same time I played Monkey Island, I discovered Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Coincidentally, also in high school, and I loved it. So, John Williams also had a huge influence on my
On
life.
everybody, he's amazing.
Yeah, like almost every video game composer I talk to, at some stage they would say, "Oh, we study the Star Wars scores. We study the orchestration. Everybody studies
Yeah,
Star Wars. It's hugely
yeah,
influential."
absolutely.
How did the soundtrack of Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis work for you as a composer? Like, what artistic choices did you take to sound like John Williams, but also sound unique?
Yeah, that was an interesting one. So in that game, uh, Peter and Clint probably did more music than I did, but we all sort of three of us worked very closely with Hal Barwood, the project leader. And Hal came from the film industry and had been a director and screenwriter and done a lot of stuff. And he really, really knew uh, the language of um, of motion picture and by extension the language of music for picture. And so
Mm.
he really knew what was right and what wasn't. He gave us a lot of guidance. He really understood when something was aligned with the right emotion, or if it wasn't quite aligned, he would let us know and give us, really good advice for how to get on track. And so in that game, it wasn't as much about trying to sound like John Williams or try, like we obviously you get the main theme going because it's like it's iconic, but for the rest of the game, it was really more about trying to just capture the spirit of each location and really try to make it seem uh, emotionally accurate and aligned with what was going on in the game. And that I think we did a pretty good job, and it was certainly a lot of fun working with Hal. And those such beautiful, the artwork is so beautiful. It's always a pleasure when you have just gorgeous artwork to be able to just score gorgeous backgrounds and stuff. It's really nice.
Have you played some of the Indiana Jones and the Great Circle,
I have not, no.
the newest game? I'm playing it at the moment, and I think it's it's one of the best games I've played in years.
Wow,
It's
nice.
it's like being in an Indiana Jones movie. The attention of detail in everything is amazing, and
Oh wow,
the
yeah.
music scoring is just as good. And I thought like, wow, this is such a long game. The amount of music must have been composed for this. I'm not sure how long the soundtrack is, but it's huge, and it sounds like John Williams. It's not John Williams, but it sounds like John Williams,
It's a
and
tall
really
order.
in the style of Indiana Jones. It's breathtaking. I love it.
Oh, that's great. I'll check it
Really
out. Yeah,
amazing game. So I'm
nice.
glad that even the legacy of John Williams and Harrison Ford and of course George Lucas and Indiana Jones it's continuing
That's so cool.
through
Yeah.
video games. So your next big game was Star Wars Rebels and X-Wing. That was in the same year, 1993, correct?
I think so. Yeah.
That's my research pointed me to 1993.
Hmm.
So, did you also try to imitate the unique harmonic sounds and harmonic choices of John Williams?
Yeah, so that one when doing X-Wing and that the sort of the flight simulator stuff, that was when we did finally say, you know what, we have to get a little bit of this sound
Mm.
into our music. And so I actually went there's a composition from called The Battle, which is the big climactic battle scene in Star Wars. I took the orchestral score, I got a copy of the orchestral score, and I tracked the whole darn thing. It's like a 11-minute piece. I tracked it up in MIDI, all the parts, and just kind of like, okay, wow, that's how we did it. And I don't think I could have even come close to, uh, you know, getting something that even sounded remotely authentic if I hadn't done that, because just the way
Mm.
he layers the different, you know, like he'll have two completely unrelated triads layered on top of each other, and it's like, oh, what a cool sound. And you have to see it in detail to really be able to understand how to just open your mind to that approach.
Mm.
So that was
I,
fun.
I,
Then
I
yeah,
have no interest in meeting John Williams. I admire him from afar greatly, but I don't
yeah,
think I would have anything to offer him or to say, listen to my music.
yeah, I know.
However, if I ever had the opportunity to meet him, I would like to ask, Sir, why is the scores not published? Why are your scores not published?
Right.
You can get pirated scores on PDFs all over the internet. I've seen a few, and when you see that, like, oh my goodness, Star Wars Episode 3, oh wow, look at this, it's amazing, and you see the actual handwriting, and you follow that, and like, wow, this is amazing, this is my favorite cue. Why is it not published? Where can I get it? I mean, John William hardcore fans pirate like crazy because there's no other way to get the script. I'm not even sure if the word pirate is the correct word, but
Right.
it's such a rarity, and it's very difficult
Yeah,
to get hold of.
you're absolutely right. Yep. It's a resource, and it's I mean it's yeah, it it deserves to be kind of part of humanity's permanent library.
Mm. What Hal? What is the publisher? Hal? Let me look it up here. Publisher John Williams scores. Hal Leonard. Hal Leonard.
Right.
So
That's
what
right.
Hal Leonard publishes is only the suites, official
Uh-huh.
music for concerts,
Right,
not
exactly.
what we actually want to see as composers.
Which is the actual movie scores. Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, it's hundreds of pages. I don't think they're interested in publishing hundreds of pages anyway.
No, it would be more for the, educational purposes. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So you also in the same year you had a lot of fun scoring Day of the Tentacle and Sam and Max Hit the Road.
Yep.
And I mean
That's
you
right.
did this along with Star Wars in the same year. So that's quite a tonal shift from very
Quite a,
serious film
quite a
music thing
shift.
to
Yeah.
funky games. How were these two soundtracks different from the Star Wars soundtracks for you? How were they different in terms of maybe feeling, composition, and how did they influence you personally?
So again, with both of those, Day of the Tentacle and Sam and Max, Peter McConnell was really the lead composer on that. So, and then Day of the Tentacle, Peter and Clint were kind of co-lead composers. I did a few tracks there,
Mm.
but those guys took the lead on that one, and it was like it was basically, how do I say this? If you think about the Star Wars uh, as being, an homage to John Williams, then certainly Day of the Tentacle was an homage to like Looney Tunes. It was really about like, okay, how can we, you know, how can we make it sound like one of those crazy old cartoons? And so, uh, I mean, Peter's a real aficionado of that genre, and I think Clint just sort of is naturally wacky, and I just kind of did my best to absorb from those two guys and you know follow along with their lead, and it was a lot of fun. And again, it's sort of like because they're so different from the sort of the serious sort of Star Wars, Tie Fighter, X-wing kind of stuff. Um, it's it's like you get both of them is kind of a relief from the other. In other words, it's really nice to be working in really different genres at the same time because you get deeply into one sort of score and it's like then you switch and you go into something that's like the opposite extreme and it's nice. You get to really just sort of go, okay, all the muscles, the mental muscles that you were exercising here, those get to relax and a whole new set of muscles kicks in. So it's nice.
And it's fun to do such a contrast in one year,
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, of course, 1994, you had Star Wars TIE Fighter and 1995, Star Wars Dark Forces. How did you manage to keep your music fresh with such a tight composition schedule?
I mean, it was a team effort. I was at that time kind of managing the department. The department was growing, and I was trying to compose when I could.
Mm.
But over the course of those years, from from between like 1990 and 1991, I was doing a ton of composing, and then over the course of the next few years, yeah, the games just kept on coming, and more and more Peter and Clint took on the compositional load, and then we had. Sometimes some of this stuff had some outside work from other sort of contracted composers, but basically it was putting together a team that could deliver high quality across all these schedules that kept kicking in.
Mm.
So yeah, that becomes a real factor.
Yeah, I don't think non-film composers and non-gaming composers know the stress of timelines.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
It's so tight, and especially in the video game industry, you're contacted a week before or a month before, and like, oh my goodness, we suddenly realize we needed music. I'm like, oh, where have you been all this time? What have you been thinking about?
I know. I know
Uh,
the way I think about it is you're getting squeezed. Like the art always runs late, and the programming then is after the art, and that runs even later. But the deadline never moves, and so the time where you have a finished product, where you have programming and art mostly working, between then and the deadline, it just gets incredibly tight, and they expect all the music to happen in that point. So, it's nice to be able to talk to the developers and the project leader early in the process and get their concepts and then see the early art. But ultimately, it's really hard to totally nail down the music until you have a playable game with real art, and then okay, this is the experience I'm scoring, and
hmm.
that can end up being very late in the production cycle where you finally get to that point. And yes, it does create a lot of tension. I remember once somebody, some news crew or something was, going around LucasArts asking the different teams, like, so, what do you, this is such a beautiful, campus. This was like on, at Skywalker Ranch. It's like, what do you find that inspires creativity? And, they think you're going to answer like the beautiful mountains, but it's really, no, it's the deadlines. That's what inspires the creativity.
That's true. That's so true. Yeah, but I do say I really hate when you have an interview with someone you're a fan of, and you watch the interview, and then they ask such really horrible, useless questions. what do you drink? What do you like to drink every morning when you wake up? Does it bring you inspiration? Like what?
Yeah,
Ask me
yeah,
technical questions. I'm looking forward to the technical questions and learning more about the composer and the music or whatever. People, journalism.
yeah. I know, I know.
So, um, of course, next year I had the Curse of Monkey Island in 2000, and this is a. I noticed the great thing about Monkey Island. Each game is very different. Art style, the story, of obviously the music, but every game is stylistically different. And this particular game has strong theatrical direction. As we know, there's singing pirates, and compared to obviously the previous games, longer, much longer cutscenes. How did the composition tone of the Curse of Monkey Island influenced you? Like, did you have to go to theatrical sources, or maybe got inspiration for some from some movies or films, maybe?
Not, let me think about that. Let me actually back up a second though, because if we're going in chronological order, I think in 1995 was the year I worked on The Dig, and that
Mm,
was for me a big opportunity because I had, as I said, had been doing less composing, but then everybody we as a team we was like, you know what, Mike hasn't been doing much composing. Let's get a game where he's the lead composer, and so I ended up
mm,
basically doing The Dig pretty much as a solo composition effort, and that was really for me my sort of one opportunity in this space where the music that the game demanded and the music that I sort of feel inside myself on my deepest level, kind of my personal music, were really aligned. So I was able to essentially go, you know what, I'm going to write music on this one that is coming from sort of my own heart and my own core because it just happens to fit with these atmospheres that they're creating here. So that was a really nice opportunity. Again, a tight deadline, and it was intense, but it was nice. And then we had a chance to do a soundtrack, uh, of the score. That was like the one original soundtrack I got to do during my time at Lucas, and that was wonderful because I got to hire some amazing musicians and sort of revisit the music in a linear form, which was like in a way the opposite because in a lot of these story games, not necessarily in an action game, but in a story game, a lot of times you enter a new space and there's like a big flourish and then there's a nice theme and then that theme kind of meanders and eventually it wanders and it kind of goes down and it then piddles out and you get like an ambient loop of atmospheric sound effects, right? So it
mm,
has this
mm,
arc of like a big sort of entrance and then it just sort of fizzles away, and that's appropriate because the player, if you're going to spend any significant time in a room, after that initial atmospheric, introduction, you want to be able to just focus and just do your thing as a player and not have the music be pushing you if you've been there a while. Now, if you're jumping around
mm,
from room to room, then all those transitions, you want to make sure they're well scored. Well,
mm,
in a CD and in actually really music in the traditional sense, music that's not game music, meaning most music, the arc is the opposite. It may enter kind of lightly and slowly and then build and then it builds and builds and builds and then there's a big climax at the end, right? So it's the opposite shape from the game music, and that was really like, okay, finally I get to write music that goes up in energy instead of down in energy. So that was nice.
mm.
But then yeah, that was in '95, and then I think Curse was it '97 or '8 or somewhere. It was a couple of years later. It wasn't all the way to
Yeah,
2000. A bit later.
I just saw I mixed up one of my questions. Yeah, I mixed up one of two of the questions. Yeah, it was about 1990. Yeah, 1997, right?
Yeah, and so
Mm,
that one, yeah. So your question about Curse in terms of the sort of the style and the approach. So the thing that was different for Curse for me was it wasn't based on MIDI. It wasn't a MIDI synthesizer like. Um, uh, and actually, The Dig was actually my first game that was a digital audio game. So I got to actually, in fact, you should mention on The Dig, I had taken, we got the rights to use a CD of Wagner overtures. And so I went and took went through all these overtures, and anywhere in Wagner where in like there's like 12 different overtures, and they're gorgeous and they're big, wonderful pieces. Anywhere where there was a measure or two of a sort of continuous chord without a really obvious melody, which, if you know Wagner, is a lot of it, um, I chopped it up and put it and turned it into a sample. So I had samples for basically all of the chords. There's 24 major and minor chords. I had samples for all of them, multiple samples for all of them. That was a real recording of the London Symphony playing Wagner, and I wrote the synth score for the Dig on a Kurzweil 2000, and then I would paste in these Wagner samples of real orchestra playing just this chord, and now the next chord might be from a completely different piece. In fact, it was probably from a completely different piece, and that just made the it made the score really weird, but also really just kind of like deep and interesting. So that was fun too. I should mention that because it's like
Yeah.
never done that before or since, but it was very cool. So to then carry that back to Curse of Monkey Island. So in the Curse of Monkey Island, I realized, okay, the palette in the Dig was uh, very limited. Just a few different synth patches, and then this Wagner. That was like the whole palette for the most part. A little bit of other stuff here and there, but mostly it was that. So in the chorus, I went the other extreme, and I was using E4 samplers, which were the big samplers at the time, and I think I had like four of them, so I had like a ton of sample space to work with, and I came up with a template in Performer, which today doesn't sound so strange, but at the time it was like, wow, this is amazing. Which is I had like 100 and something tracks of, like, I thought to myself, what is every possible instrument that might be useful in a Monkey Island game?
Mm.
Including the full orchestra and all the sort of a bunch of the strange orchestral instruments and all the folk instruments and all the rock instruments. And it's like stack them all up in a template, and that was like, okay, I mean, today that wouldn't seem so weird, but at the time it was like I was in heaven. And so that template was every piece I started in Monkey Island, in the Curse of Monkey Island, started with that template. And I'd be like, okay, which of these 100 instruments do I want to start with? What's the first instrument? What's a lot of times? So if it was a groove, it was obviously start with the bass and drums, maybe an organ. But if it's an orchestra, maybe you start with a little string thing, and then add some other orchestral instruments. If it's a folk thing, you might start with whatever a fluty thing or something. But the point was that the 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 theatricality in that score was due to the fact that there was such a broad spectrum of instruments, like right at my
Mm.
fingertips,
Mm.
and I could jump from one to the other and mix and match, and it was pretty cool. Like, and then we did have a lot of good live players. We had this accordion player who came in, and he had literally won a national accordion contest like the year before,
That's
and he
amazing.
was like literally like the best accordion player in America, and this guy was insane. And so I would write these accordion parts that were like, okay, you get a nice rhythm going, like, ding 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 ding, and I'd be like, okay, let's throw some accordion triplets in there, right? And so when I put that sheet music in front of him in the studio, and we hit record, he was like, "You need to practice it." He'd look at, nah. So we hit record, and he'd like play it perfectly the first time, and it'd be like,
Yeah.
holy crap. And then he'd be like, let me do one more. And then the second time he'd be like, "Arr," and he'd just rip into it and just kill it. And it was just like, oh my God. So I got this, experience of really enjoying working with live players. Played with a great guitarist named David Immelgluck, who is currently playing with Counting Crows, and he was just like a master electric guitar player. Like, he got these sounds out of the instrument. He had just this touch. So, it was wonderful just to be able to, you know, bring in the real players. That was eye opening.
So it's kind of interesting that you mentioned Wagner. Of course, we know that he had wonderful moments and terrible quarters of an hour, according to Rossini. That's
Hmm.
because Rossini is so melodic, and
Right.
Wagner is like here's a chord.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
if you think about it like that, you understand where Rossini came from.
Totally. Yeah.
And something I really appreciate, I've always appreciated, but especially today when I listen to your soundtracks again, for Monkey Island, for Curse of Monkey Island and Escape from Monkey Island, you will have a melody playing a mandolin, and it goes to a accordion, and it goes to bassoon, and it's the same melody, but you jump between different instruments.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
beautiful. It's wonderful, and
Oh,
of
thanks.
course it's theatric, but it keeps the music very fresh.
Thanks. Yeah, that was part of the effect of having all those instruments just at the fingertips because,
Mm.
there was no effort on my part as a composer to switch from one to the other. I just press a different button and now I'm playing a different part. And you're right. The sonic shifting of instruments really helps a lot. I think.
Mm.
Yeah.
So now to the question that I mixed up. Now,
Hmm.
2000, you did Escape from Monkey Island.
Hmm.
So this is the first time we had a 3D video game for Monkey Island, and I was thinking that moving from 2D to 3D, it might feel more spacious in terms of actually seeing a 3D space as opposed to a flat surface.
Hmm.
Do you think that influenced the way you composed, perhaps? When I think about Escape from Monkey Island, sometimes the soundtrack feels very broad in a very good way.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so. In Escape from Monkey Island, Peter, Clint, and I also, all three of us worked on that one, and I did like the first island, and then those guys each did the bulk of the rest of the game,
Mm,
and that was actually, I think Clint kind of took the lead on that. So I think you are hearing a kind of an expansion of the palette as we had gotten more into. I mean, at that point, uh, digital scores where you're not stuck in a MIDI palette, but you can just bring in any sound you want, had become,
mm,
we were starting to stretch out a little bit more, and I think Peter and Clint definitely took it further sonically in that. Whereas in my part of that game, I will say I kept it pretty narrow. I was like, you know what? I think that first island that I'm doing, I wanted to have it sound kind of like uh, old school pirate. Like I
mm,
kept it pretty focused on the sort of core Monkey Island instruments and then when you got to those other islands with all that other weird stuff happening, that's when they took it out into all those other places with a sort of a much broader palette. And so that was
mm.
kind of, I think, intentional.
So you wrote the Scum Bar.
No, I didn't write the Scumm Bar theme. By the way, is an old English theme, and I think it was Barney Jones who, in the original Monkey Island, who pulled that theme in and applied it to Monkey Island. But a traditional English drinking song, is what it is.
Dun, 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 dun. That one.
Oh no, that one was
Dun,
Clint.
dun.
That I think that was a Clint tune. No, that was an original tune. That was right. That was a different Scumm Bar theme
Yeah,
in
the
that
second
game.
one.
Yeah, and that was a that I think Clint wrote that tune. He's a great tune. It's an
It
excellent
is
tune.
it is a great tune. Uh,
Yeah,
so at high school, there might be a school concert of sorts, and I would play that on the recorder, and people would go nuts and like, "Oh, this is amazing! This is
yeah.
and of course it is some sort of highlight for them, as it
Clint
was
has a
for
real
me."
Clint has a real talent for writing old English folk song kind of stuff. Like he does it. He knows how to do it
Yeah.
so well. Yeah.
So of course your next soundtrack was Psychonauts, but you were only a bass player there. So
Yeah, that's
did you
Peter's
have
score.
any creative influence on the?
No, not really. That was, that Peter and Tim Schafer back in Grim Fandango established a really tight connection, and they continue to work to this day together.
Mm,
So that's, Psychonauts was entirely Peter, and Psychonauts 2 was Peter, and, pretty much most of, I think, if not all of what Tim does, Pieter scores, and they just have a natural affinity. His musical style and Tim's sort of game style, they just go together really well. And so,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
you know, Pieter brought us in. We did a recording session at Skywalker Ranch, which is amazing. Skywalker Ranch is such a wonderful place to record. Everything is so high quality, and it was so fun. And yeah, we had a really good time doing
So, are some of the John Williams scores lying about in
that.
Skywalker Ranch?
I don't. They probably are in some drawer somewhere, I would imagine. Yeah, but it's so cool. Like you walk down a hallway and there's like 85 gold records on the wall for engineering, and it's like wow, it's
I
cool.
think that place is like a museum
Yeah, it is. It's really great.
of the most amazing sort. So,
Yeah.
did you have involvement in the Tales of Monkey Island?
Yeah, I did. I think I did pretty much all the music for them, and that was it was strange because that was for the it was released in these little whatever forget was it discs or I can't remember what the format was, but because of the space limitations, I guess it was online if I think about it.
Yeah,
I'm
it
not
was.
sure.
Let me just double check.
I think it was an online release, and because it's
Hmm.
online, they had these. It was like they were like mini games, and so they
Episodes,
had
right? Episodes.
yeah, and they had real space limitations for storage, and so it was back to the world of MIDI. So
Hmm.
it was like I did the score as a general MIDI score, and it was it was almost like being in 1992 again.
Although it was 2009.
Exactly.
When I played Escape from Monkey Island in 2000, I thought, okay, this is the end of the story. So,
Right.
did you ever thought of coming back?
Never had occurred to me that there'd be more. Yeah. Yeah.
I think every time you think, okay, this is the end, and then Ron Gilbert comes up with something new.
Yeah. Yeah.
So never say never. You never know what's going to happen
You
next in Monkey
never
Island.
know. Yeah. You never know.
So I'm thinking, finally, you had a completely different studio now. Terrible Toy Box
Yeah.
made 2002 Return to Monkey Island.
Yeah.
How was it different for you to compose with this studio, because you've got different programmers, different artists?
Actually, it wasn't different. That's the funny thing about it. It was Ron Gilbert and Dave Grossman and David Fox,
Mm.
and it was like and me and Peter and Clint, and it was like getting the band back together. So it was like a lot of the people on Monkey Island 1 uh, were were involved, and it was Ron Gilbert's vision to just put the team back together and do another one in secret. So it was a blast, and of
So
course. Yeah,
my confusion is the art style is so different. So,
it's so different. And Ron
so
took a lot of
it's the
heat
same
from that.
people who worked on it.
Not the same artist. That was the one.
Mm.
The one thing that was different was the art team.
I
But
see.
it
I
but
see.
it was Ron. Ron was calling the shots. I mean, that art style was Ron's decision, and it really has turned out to be polarizing. Some people love it, some people hate it. Some people sort of hate it at first and then get used to it and then love it. But that's a whole big discussion in another channel somewhere. But yeah, that part was really different, but everything else was really familiar.
I've put the game on the side now. I haven't finished Return to Monkey Island yet. I'm stuck somewhere with some puzzle.
Yep.
And
Yep.
now I'm frustrated myself with the puzzle. Like, why is it so difficult? So it
Yeah.
is a difficult. It is a different game.
Yeah. Totally.
From about the half of the game that I've played, I liked it up to the point where I got stuck. Now I've
Yep.
started play. Let's play something else.
Yep. You got to do that for sure.
So I'm gonna ask you. Maybe you can think of six pieces. If you think of
Okay.
six Monkey Island games, what were your favorite themes that you wrote from each Monkey Island game?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, the main theme is a favorite. It
You
came to
did
me.
you did that by yourself.
Yeah, and that was a. It came to me one day when I was just jamming on an organ, and I started playing that you know, a reggae groove, and then the melody started happening. And the thing about that melody is you kind of, once it starts, you kind of have to follow it along, and it just takes you through it, and then it's done. So that was cool. So that was one. I'm really fond of the wood tick theme or themes because there's several of them, but they're all kind of the same melody and different personalities. Um, that one, you know, it's always felt like a somewhat authentic pirate tune to me, so I like that. Um, uh, One that didn't get very much attention, but I really like is the that sort of rustic pirate theme from Escape from Monkey Island. It's kind of dun dun ba da dun 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 bum bum.
Yes, I know where that.
That
I know exactly.
yeah, that one is kind of a favorite. I think the cemetery theme from Monkey Island 2 is pretty cool. It has a few traditional funeral type things in it, but it uses them in a way that's kind of fun and cool. Um, I enjoy doing some of the roller coaster music. I think at the end of Monkey 2, there's some nice stuff there. And of course, one I think I really loved is the Bone Dance. I think that was in Monkey Island 2. The Bone Dance was a lot of fun. And then in Curse of Monkey Island, I forget which island it is. I think it's Blood Island, but one of them has a tune for the overview that I really love. And of course, I really like the Puerto Palo music. That's the ambience for Puerto Palo and the Barbershop, which are both kind of
Mm,
fun Monkey Islandy kind of tunes. So that's kind of a those are kind of the ones that jump out to mind.
good. Who wrote the theme for the French guy? What is his name? In Tales of Monkey Island.
Uh, oh
Mar-
yeah,
Marquis de.
yeah, that guy.
Who wrote that theme?
I must have. I think it was me. And in fact, I think he was. You're not talking about what was how did they call him? It wasn't. It's like a takeoff on LeChuck. It wasn't LeChuck. It was.
Yeah, the one with the pox.
Yeah.
Let me see, what is his name? Marquis de Singe.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah, Marquis de Singe. Yeah, and that was a kind of like a classical harpsichord thing, if I remember, with a lot of little descending things. Yeah, yeah, I wrote that one.
Oh
And of course,
wow.
the LeChuck theme. You got to list the LeChuck theme as well because that's a fun tune.
Yeah.
So those are kind of yeah.
I played the LeChuck. Did you write Largo LeGrand?
No, that was Peter. Peter wrote that.
Well, I of course I played LeChuck on piano endlessly. I remember at high school playing at a friend's wedding. They put the piano outside in the garden. They had like an outside garden, and at some stage I ran out of songs to play, so I started to playing Monkey Island, and people
Wow.
came up to me like, "Oh, I know. Oh, you're playing Monkey Island. Oh, I used to play that at high school or something like
Oh, that's so cool. Wow,
that." That was so cool. And
that's great.
I have a really good arrangement of Largo LeGrand,
Oh, cool.
the
Yeah.
virtuosic one. But they are the. I heard that you wrote LeChuck's theme whilst urinating.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Was
That's
that
right.
at the studio?
Yeah, it was an office building where I had a studio in one of the office rooms, and yeah, I went into the bathroom, and you know, when I walked out, I was like, I had the melody in my head. Yeah, it was so funny.
So either it was a very long P or it was a very quick composition.
Yeah, it was a quick composition because it was one of those things where I had been thinking about the character. And there was, I mean, literally, it just sounds so weird, but there was something about being at a urinal that just made me like, oh, this character is is a, there's something about LeChuck and a urinal that just clicked. I don't know
He's
how to
stinky.
explain
He's
it.
a stinky person.
He's a stinky person. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, something like that.
Have you ever got unscripted question? Have you ever gotten inspiration whilst in the shower?
Yes and no. Nothing that I've been able to turn into anything, but yeah, sometimes in the shower it frees up your sense of melodic creativity. Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes I would have a shower and like, whoa, interesting ideas.
Yeah.
Wow, what did that? Oh, wow, this is fantastic. Let's go and write it down, and it works. But sometimes you,
Yeah, it is.
this
There's
is
something
like,
freeing about being in a shower. I completely agree with you on that.
so. How do you think the iMuse system influenced your general approach to composition?
Well, I think I talked about that a little bit already, but it really had to do with, what we call nonlinear music, right? So most music through all of time is a linear experience. It, goes from beginning to middle to end and ends. And game music is not linear. Game music is much more like a map, and a map is not linear. A map is two-dimensional, and you traverse a map with different pathways. And any given pathway might be linear, but the map
Mm,
itself is not linear. And so the music, you have to conceive of it in a nonlinear way. You have to think of it as a set of possibilities, and what happens if this happens, and what happens if that happens. You know, just as an example, because it's pretty relevant to that. I talk about this idea of a summit. Well, with the dig, the way the game was structured, they had 7 different spires, big sort of things sticking out of the ocean, and a central area in the middle. And
mm,
so what I came up with was a chord for each spire, a different chord, and in the middle you walk around this circle and you can take a tram out to any of the spires. And so in this station in the middle where you can walk around in a circle, every time you go from one uh, sort of exit point to the next exit point, there's a transition from one chord to the next chord, and you can go in either direction. You can go around this way or you can go around this way. And the challenge was to find 7 chords where every change from one chord to the next as you walked around the circle in either direction was absolutely gorgeous. It just made you go, ah. And then once you have that, when you're in that chord and you take the trip out to that spire, that chord becomes the sort of grounding center of that spire, and all the other stuff works off of that as a departure point, and then you come back to that, and then you take the trip back to the middle, you're in that chord, and then you go to the next thing or the next thing, and each time there's a transition, it just and it's challenging to come up with 7 chords where you go either direction around the circle, and either way it creates a gorgeous chord set of chord changes,
mm,
and that was an example of nonlinear music.
I'm thinking of actually I'm going to answer my own question talking about your music.
All right.
I'm thinking of the end of LeChuck's theme. Da 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 dun 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 bum. It feels very final,
Yes,
and that was before iMuse.
that's right. That's exactly right. That's
So
exactly
there,
right.
but nonetheless, yeah, I answered my own question.
Hmm.
Do you receive? I mean, obviously through the years, but have you received a lot of fan remixes or fan mail?
I get occasionally notes, which is wonderful. I love hearing from people, and I don't, people don't necessarily send remixes to me, but I do run across them. Sometimes people post them to different, chat groups and stuff, and I love hearing them. It's so wonderful hearing that music have a life of its own. With so many creative people have taken it for a spin, and it's just wonderful. Can't even express how grateful
I've
I am
I've
about
heard
that.
a lady play on organ.
I think I've heard that one. It's wonderful. Yeah,
She's
it's
really
great.
good. She's
Yeah,
really, really good.
really good musicians. Yeah, a lot of them are really good. Yeah.
Yeah. So I appreciate that, like you said, you step away from the music and other people's professionals take it over and transform it into its own. Yeah. I was to say it gets a life of its own and becomes a work of art in its own right. Although
Yeah.
it's still your music. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
What are some of your current projects that you're working on?
Huh. Well, I'm a professional programmer. These days I'm writing code for a living. Um, I play electric bass in a Grateful Dead band, and that's really fun because I've really worked hard over the years to develop a tone that has full frequency range. Like, the bass, it to really deliver a pure sine wave at, high volume that sounds really pure is a challenge. It takes a
Mm.
lot of equipment, so that's been a real project over the years that I've enjoyed very much. Um, and Another thing about the electric bass is I play with a pick, and I'm lately been using a stone pick that's pretty thick, but you have to really learn how to sort of pull it through the string in a gentle way to get a nice round sound out of a really hard, thick pick. And so that's been enjoyable. And then for a while, I was playing a lot of Irish guitar, which is a whole trip unto itself because Irish music doesn't have like official chord changes, so to speak. Like the melodies are canonical. Everybody plays, they do a lot, the ornamentation. Everybody does the ornaments differently, and that's part of the charm of Irish music is giving it those ornaments in the melody. Like that. I can't do it. I can't sing it, but a little wiggles and things that go in just the right way, give the melody a lot of life. But the thing about it when you're playing an accompanying chordal instrument with Irish music is there's no roadmap, and so a lot of people play those chords in a very sort of straight ahead way, but I've had the good fortune to uh, learn and observe a few players, especially this guy Shay Black, who's an amazing player, grew up in Dublin, um, where the chords that they choose are highly counterintuitive and cool as hell. Like they play against the melody in these really cool ways that create these dissonances that push the music forward. And so that's sort of what I have. That's the aspect of that music that I found really interesting. It's always for me an interesting thing that I've always tried to balance in music. It's like a razor's edge where, uh, you know, you have the traditional and expected way that a melody or a chord change or a chord and melody together would go,
Mm.
and then there's music that's really out, that's always doing crazy stuff. But I've always tried to find that middle point where it's like, okay, you have something that sounds very understandable, almost traditional or expected, but you throw curveballs here and there. You push the harmonies a little bit more to the flat side, than you would expect. You do a flat seven instead of a five chord here and there, and then maybe your flat seven takes you up to a minor three chord when you're in a major key, and stuff like that, where it's like you just kind of push the limits of traditional, but you don't completely bust them apart and go crazy into the realm of you know abstract or modern. So that's what I find interesting. That's why when I describe this Irish player, that's what they're doing. They're sort of staying within the realm of the traditional, but they're pushing the limits and finding these sort of cool things that are outside the realm of traditional but don't break the traditional feeling.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, you seem to have a very busy schedule. Do you have time to write music for yourself? Do you write music for yourself?
Not lately, but I've started writing a little bit. A couple of years ago, I did a little bit, but I'm sort of how do I say this? I'm trying to position my life so that I can spend a good chunk of my later years, which I'm already in, writing music because I have a lot more music I want to write, and so I'm trying to get myself set up to where I'm going to be able to do that.
Mm. For younger composers trying to break into the industry, what is your best advice?
Um, I would say uh, That's a great, it's a great question. I don't want to answer it too quickly. You want to find as much as possible. You want to kind of know what your voice and your perspective is, and you also want to understand your craft, your technique, the traditions, the stylistic idioms that everybody knows. You need to you and so it's and then you need to thread that needle where you're putting your heart and soul into it while still working within the idioms that are required.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's and like I say, in my case, it was like I mentioned, I like setting up a sort of a traditional harmonic structure and then pushing the boundaries of it a little bit. That's my personal, enjoyment. Um, so whatever style of music I was writing, I would be bona fide and work in that style, but I'd always find little ways to push the harmonies into a little further than the style traditionally would expect. But whatever it is that turns you on as a composer, maybe you're really into, you know, um, rhythmic, overlays, or sort of cross rhythms, or things that are rhythmically complex, or maybe you really like counterpoint. So whatever it is that is your deepest musical soul, you need to honor that, but not in a way that just focuses on that at the expense of what the situation demands. Because music for picture is a very uh, balanced art form. Like if you're just doing what the sort of job requires, if you're just doing the things the traditional way, your music might not have a lot of resonance. It might not, it might perfectly fit the bill, but so will, 1,000 other people's music fit the bill just as well. And if you're just following your own muse, you shouldn't be doing music for picture, because the job of music for picture is to support the picture. So the trick with music for picture is to, job number one is support the picture, but job number two is put real soul into it. I mean, when you hear a John Williams score, you can say of it two things. Number one, it absolutely supports the picture, and number two, it absolutely has his personal stamp on it. Those two things are completely cranking, and they're not in conflict. They're in harmony, and that's I think the best way to succeed.
That's excellent advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, over the past 30 years, audio processing changed drastically. What is your current DAW and why do you like to work in it?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have two. Well, three actually. Sometimes I work in Cubase when I want to sort of just like do, say, a tune. If I want to just track up a few guitar tracks, I'll probably do that in Cubase. Um, but for doing actual professional work, I use a combination of Performer for the initial scoring, and then for any MIDI work, I personally like Performer. But then when you get into the actual serious mixing and production work, you go to Pro Tools for that.
Mm.
So Performer, and then from Performer into Pro Tools. Like for example, the way I worked in Return to Monkey Island is I did a lot of work in Performer, and then bounced all of those tracks individually into stems in Pro Tools, and then we layered on the live tracks in Pro Tools. So they're both of those are heavy duty programs, but that's what you wanted. If you want to be in a nowadays, it seems like production is really advanced for games, and that's kind of how it's done. But if you're just doing something for fun, if I'm just doing something for fun, I probably use Cubase because it's just low overhead.
Mm. I've spoken to so many people who run away from Pro Tools.
Yeah, it's a bear. But
It's a
for when you really are getting into, like, you know serious editing, serious, automated mixing and stuff like that, with lots of effects that you need to control and all that stuff. And yeah, I mean it's it is full featured.
How do you think MIDI will change in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't.
Did you bring your crystal ball, by the way?
I did not, but
Damn.
I remember this thing that a guy who recently passed called Keith McMillan was doing called Zippy, which was an attempt to. He was the guy who did Zeta violins. It was an attempt to uh, reimagine MIDI with continuous controls at the forefront. So instead of a continuous controller being sort of like a mod wheel or whatever, it's more like I can play a violin and I have a converter that doesn't just read the pitch but reads all kinds of timbral nuances, and then I can take that recording of that you know multi-dimensional control information and apply it to a sampled clarinet. Not sampled, by the way. It would probably have to be, some kind of, more modern synthesis that's sort of generated on the fly, uh, as opposed because a sample doesn't respond to all of that control information. So the idea that a really skilled wind player or a really skilled bowed instrument player, the emotion that comes through those instruments is because there are many, many dimensions of sound being modified in real time relative to one another to create the the level of emotion you get from a human voice that's singing, for example. Um, MIDI, note on, note off, based on a keyboard, piano, not even piano, basically a piano paradigm. Harder, softer, note on, note off. That's the MIDI paradigm. So I think at some point, electronic instruments will evolve toward a paradigm, a transport layer or whatever, a control layer that uh, can capture all those multidimensional things that you get from uh, more, you know, more sort of subtle instruments. I know that people try to do that with MIDI, but it's a little bit like you need a lot of um, infrastructure to be able to try to do that with MIDI. And
Yeah, yeah.
I think that at some point it'll be like there'll be something down the road that's just plug and play where everybody's like, I can make my you know, my electric instrument sound as expressive as a well played, uh, you know, wind or string instrument. The trick there, of course, is where do you get the control information from if you don't happen to be a really skilled wind or string player?
Mm.
And so that's the part I'm not sure of. For somebody who can, play a clarinet beautifully and capture that performance and apply it to something else, that they have the ability. It'll be easy to do that. But I'm just wondering, for somebody who's not that, where does that come from? Can you maybe do it with your voice? I don't know. We'll see.
Well, thank God we're halfway there. I'm sure more than halfway,
Yeah.
because we're rid of all those endless cables and sea of cables. I think
Yeah.
I
Right.
working with MIDI when I was younger gave me a phobia of working with MIDI and
Yep. Absolutely. It's madness.
working with cables and in and outs and channels. I go, it never ends.
Never ends. Yeah. Yeah.
Final question, Michael: Is there any game that you wish you had the opportunity to score? You say,
You know,
I wish I really
yeah,
that.
the one game that comes to mind was from a long time ago, but when I first saw Myst, I don't know if you know that game.
Mm.
I thought, oh my God, this is so beautiful. I would have loved to have done the score for that. Um, yeah.
There's a Mystery Master.
Oh yeah.
It's been done in the Unreal Engine.
Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
I'd like to
Nice.
play that.
Yeah.
Michael, it's been fantastic, an honor to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Peter, and your interview and questions and the way you have explored these subjects has been wonderful. So I very much appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a thank you very much. I had a great time, and
Yeah, me too.
it goes both ways. I had a great time. You had a great time. Thank you for everything.
Absolutely.
Thank you for the
Thanks.
music.
Thank you.
And this, I can't say the songs I'm singing, but surely the songs I'm playing.
Great. Awesome. Thanks a
Thank
lot,
you.
Peter. Take
Bye.
care. Bye bye.